So without further ado, we're going to switch into the density and housing theme the afternoon. And our first presentation dealing with urban density. And I would like to welcome my colleague, Professor Marcus Mose. Marcus.
Thanks, Clarence, and welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Marcus Mose. I'm with the School of Planning. This project was completed by Tara Vinodrai, who's a professor at University of Toronto, and you've heard from her earlier today. But most of the background work for this was done by a research assistant and grad student in the School of Planning, Amanda McCulley. So many thanks to her for all her efforts on this front. For the rest of this brief presentation, I want to talk about the link between population density and the spread of COVID. And when I talk about population density, I'm really referring to sort of the number of people per area at the neighborhood level, at the building level, at that larger scale. Not so much how many people are living within one unit, although we will get to that as well. Our understanding of things, of course, is still evolving, but I think in a nutshell, from the discussions and evidence to date, population density on its own is really not as much of the culprit of COVID spread as it was first thought. The relationship between COVID spread and density is not as directly causal, I think, as was first suggested by some observers. There are instances where density does coincide with increased COVID incidence and spread, and that seems to be when there's overcrowding within the unit. That is, there are more occupants within a particular housing unit, an apartment or a house, than would be sort of deemed, acceptable and sort of with having the sufficient number of bedrooms and bathrooms to accommodate that household size. So overcrowding within the unit seems to play a role. But also, of course, during the pandemics, in particular during the lockdown, we saw issues with density in terms of those denser environments where there was not necessarily surrounding or nearby open space. So in some ways, the situation basically amplifies something planners have been, talking about and been researching for a long time. And that's sort of twofold. The first one is really about an increase in density only really works if you connect it with appropriate open space. So it's going to courtyards, rooftops, gardens, balconies, surrounding parks, and so forth. Second, an increase in density is really also an issue when it's connected with affordability concerns, because that's when it starts leading to overcrowding. And this is particularly a concern for lower income groups, particularly visible minorities, refugees, recent immigrants would be overrepresented in that population, which is also a population we know from the labor side of things that is overrepresented in service sector and retail jobs, where also the risk to exposure to COVID would be higher than if you're, like me now sitting in the basement of my house. So that's sort of the overall message. And now, so let's look into it a little bit deeper, piece by piece. So on what you're seeing on the slide now is, is a screenshot from a social media account from the governor of New York, who in the early days of the pandemic was quite concerned about density levels in New York City, in this case being, he argues or suggests destructive. Now, what we've started finding in our analysis, including this particular tweet, much of what was said in the early days was, of course, based on speculation, not evidence, and on people's experiences during the initial lockdown, which is, of course, not how will things continue to unfold over many years. In the next slide, you can see a picture of our uptown in Waterloo here, where, of course, the local context is very different, as we can see on the next slide. Yes, thank you. So people saw spaces like this. I took this, sort of at the height of the lockdown, and it looked empty, so to speak. And I think naturally, people started to worry about the future of these type of spaces when people didn't congregate there anymore, given all the work that has gone into the planning and development and building of these public gathering spaces. Now, as we'll see on the next slide, that, the worries, or as I'll argue, I'll talk about on this next slide, is that our worries, of course, don't make for good evidence for the most part, right? And so we wanted to look beyond our sort of just initial worries and concerns about the future of sort of the higher density parts of our region, and look more closely at the evidence that is being used within the media to support arguments about how higher and lower density may or may not be problematic within the context of COVID. And so what we did in this context is we looked at the media, we looked at what arguments were being made within it and what was being provided to support as a supporting evidence. In some cases, there were academic studies. Of course, many of them are still being developed, but there were some early on. And in other cases, we just looked sort of at the quality of the argument. As you can see on the next slide then, what we arrived at from that analysis is really found three overarching themes of how arguments around the relationship between density and COVID were playing out. There were those who were pointing specifically to historic trends, right? And the argument there is that, well, even, back to industrialization, there were planning concepts like the Garden City movement, and even just generally suburbanization being a response to issues, and sometimes health issues, sometimes other kinds of issues, like in the case of 9/11, for instance, where it was a national security and terror threat, that there were historic incidences where people argued that they were wanting to leave large cities because of health concerns. And so the argument is that we might see that same response again today. The other argument against density has to do with the global cities. So much of the spread initially was first visible, it would seem, in large global cities. And so because of that initial growth, I think there was what we might just call an intuitive link, where people sort of saw, well, it's the big cities where it's happening, it must be because they're dense. And that because we're assuming that that's where most social contact occurs among the population. Finally, the arguments sort of against density also pointed to things surrounding urban flight, which has much more to do with our work locations and availability of open space. It's assumed that the more people work from home, that they might disperse out of the city into the countryside or into smaller towns because you're no longer as tied to a particular location because of your commute not being as regular. Also, sometimes, especially in much larger cities than our own, but there are concerns around open space. And so the argument is, does this working from home now give people an opportunity to access more open space by relocating? So that's the one side of the arguments. The other side, as we see on the next slide, is arguments in favor of density actually revolved around the very same themes in many cases, but the reasoning provided was different, right? And so then those who explored the historic trends of how cities were impacted by health emergencies and other kinds of situations found, well, that actually in many cases, and 9/11 is arguably perhaps the most recent example, is that there were very many speculations in the early days about it being sort of the end of large cities, the end of financial districts, because cities, as sort of this agglomeration of economic activity, being in some sense sort of potentially a security threat. Now, much of that discussion faded away over the years, and cities returned, and many would probably argue more substantially and even stronger than before many of the historic, whether it's pandemic or security incidences that pose doubt on people's mind as to whether cities would come around. With the global cities, it's the same. It's the same kind of question, right? It's the argument there is that actually, rather than it being the density of these cities in and of themselves, that it's the global connectivity of people moving in and out that is contributing to the potential for greater spread. But also that economic growth, is occurring in global cities and is partly a function of that density. Finally, with urban flight, there's the argument that, well, many actually are returning to a quote unquote work now, their former location. As we heard from earlier presentations, many can't work from home. Some people were being told that there actually would be salary cuts if they moved from urban regions to smaller places, which might be a disincentive to leave the larger cities. And then finally, amenities are actually just as important for many people for being close to the to urban life. And so overall, I think where we, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, arrive at with this work is that, yes, density plays a role, but it's primarily plays out through overcrowding, and that's partly an affordability problem. So in moving forward and in terms of what this means for our planning process, I think generally we would argue that when you do density, it needs to, I think we've always known this, but I think this pandemic has highlighted it even more than before, is that that density needs to be connected to open space immediately within the building, whether it's balconies or terraces, rooftop gardens, and surrounding open space. But also that density without amenities. So if we build compact urban cores that don't have things other than jobs, we may actually see that decline because there's likely going to be more home-based work than there was prior, even if it doesn't stay at the same level as today. So overall, I think the good news is that I think from an environmental perspective, from a sustainability perspective, it's long been known that it makes sense to try and grow up as opposed to out, so to speak. And even though the COVID pandemic is highlighting some challenges, that those can be addressed while you still pursue a densification objective. But particularly important is, again, the emphasis on providing open space and on ensuring affordability and appropriate housing for much of our vulnerable community members so that we can prevent overcrowding. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Marcus. We'll now move to the second presentation in this theme, dealing with the 15-minute city.
Okay, so this report has been prepared by Niluka Lianage and myself. Niluka is a doctoral candidate at the School of Planning, nearly done, nearly about to graduate. And she also works as a consultant, specializing in smart growth, public health, and also on active transportation. Incidentally, 2 years ago, we together authored a report on walkability in urban growth centers for the Growth Secretariat. So our argument is the following one, is that if public transit is not able to perform as it used to, and if public transit was the main vector or the main catalyst for intensification, what can we do instead? Density is a meal that doesn't go well on its own. It's not very appetizing on its own. It needs to have sauces in order to highlight it. And one of those sauces is public transit. And we can see that, and especially through the TOD, Transit-Oriented Development Model, that density is generally associated with public transit, and they both complement each other. The problem, though, is that with the pandemic, the public transit sauce is not as thick as it used to be, and it's not as tasty as it used to be. So it's not as effective as it used to be in order to highlight or to serve as a catalyst for density. And we don't know when, and we don't know how public transit is going to come back. I mean, Jeff discussed that, Jeff Casello discussed that in his presentation. We can be optimistic, we can be pessimistic, but it remains at the moment, public transit operates at about 25% of its usual capacity. And in many cases, services are being cut. So what we propose instead is that if public transit cannot be relied upon to serve as a means to advance density, what can we do instead? And this is a very important question in the context of Waterloo Region, because Waterloo Region has put a lot of emphasis on intensification and has used public transit as a way to promote intensification. So what we propose instead is creating a 15-minute walking neighborhood that attracts activities where it is possible, and that would essentially combine those different features. It would combine density, it would combine walkability, and it would combine a concentration of activities. Next slide, and Iluka, it's your turn.
Yes, thanks, Pierre. And also the COVID pandemic brought renewed interest and visions for sustainable cities that, having ample public spaces where safe walking and cycling can flourish. And not just because the confidence in public transit could take years to bounce back in places like Waterloo Region, but also to reclaim streets for people as a resilient way forward for cities and healthy living. So, and we've all seen around the world that some places are accelerating those active transportation investments and making those temporary space accommodations permanent. So the 15-minute city, really, it's inspired by Jane Jacobs, the human-centered approach to planning of that mix of amenities and the close proximity. And the good thing is it also shares similarities with the neighborhood unit about laying out everyday functions within these short walking distances. And transit-oriented development, here in Waterloo, it already plans and designs using this spatial temporal dimension as short as 400 meters or a 5-minute walk to stations and stops. And there's really good evidence that actually the median walking distances are much longer to transit, like double, and destination walking is actually upwards of 2 kilometers. So it's quite feasible to stretch TOD. So we see the 15-minute city as reconciling the intensification and the COVID concerns because it is grounded in walking outdoors at this smaller scale. And this means 24/7 access to fresher air that we know has lower risk of viral transmission than indoors, and including in transit vehicles and stations. There's multiple benefits as well. It provides alternative mobility to essential workers, the vulnerable people, or those in lower income and non-driving groups, especially when transit service might have to be reduced. It protects transit drivers from exposure, whether mobility when other mobility options are also viable. And there's so many synergies with the public health and the planning objectives, which are very much aligned, we see, with Waterloo Region's official plan and the local municipal directions. So obviously walking supports the physical and mental health. We know it reduces the automobile ownership and trips, so that reduces the demand and the cost for road expansion. We know that planning and designing for non-motorized users improves road safety overall and humanizes our streets. It does expand equity and access to essential services for a greater number of people. And like many of the panelists have said, working from home, there are more people doing this, but it also has them recreating in their neighborhoods. So the 15-minute city actually can provide some of that needed public realm facilities that are so critical for high density dwellers with limited interior space. And this really opens up opportunities for developing residential density inside neighborhoods and strengthening those hyperlocal activities. So walking and cycling also supports transit recovery. These really are also transit riders. And once private vehicles are bought, it really will be harder to convert back to transit. That is so important for Waterloo Region's growth. Orienting to pedestrians also addresses accessibility and upcoming curb and sidewalk management objectives. Next slide, please. So just to contrast TOD with pedestrian-oriented development a bit, clearly there's distance and time ranges of transit are larger, but both move the greatest number of people. And POD does service smaller areas like at the neighborhood scale, but it builds the ridership now and for the long term. And of course, the investments are quite dramatically different between the two, but POD can be planned and implemented faster, just as we see here across Waterloo Region with temporary facilities. And this supports the modal shifts underway that we want. And TOD supports the high density commercial residential employment mix, but with POD, we expect a staggered density approach to be achievable within a larger, say, 30-minute walking range, and with a focus on some of those missing middle options alongside a more creative and flexible commercial residential mix. And the other thing is that when we see that Todd suffers from a lack of activity, sometimes in downtowns, like in the evenings and on weekends, the 15-minute city has this benefit if that people are in their neighborhoods, hyper local activities, more of these can be encouraged. Also, with fewer safe indoor activities available, the all-season public realm facilities and programs need to be planned for. And we can draw from winter city ideas like we see in Europe as we head toward the cold and flu season. Next slide. So we see several opportunities to adapt intensification hubs along the central transit corridor to the 15-minute city. So some of our recommendations first is Todd can be stretched to 30-minute walking distances, and that can mean incenting the missing middle residential density inside neighborhoods, and also with larger and flexible units. We also think there's an opportunity to get creative, allowing at-grade commercial and office spaces to have maker spaces, pop-ups, and even residential. And there's been a growth in delivery alongside the declines in the brick and mortar retail. So we think that you can focus on hyper-local activities and consider things like STOAs, for year-round engagement around shops and neighborhoods. Second, the public realm has to be safe and comfortable, even in the winter. So we think animation and place branding strategies that welcome people yet limit large gatherings would be a good idea. Leveraging existing programs like Love My Hood, Active and Safe Routes to School. These are designed to improve those neighborhood connections and safe travel. And again, especially focus on those colder and wetter periods to get people outside at those times. And third, prioritize walking and cycling year round. And this might mean, changing sidewalk snow clearing practices done by governments, for example, and not residents. That obviously supports pandemic health if people get out year round, the modal shifts, and then the faster return to transit. Prioritizing corridors and services for essential workers, the vulnerable, and really complete those missing links in the non-motorized network. And in the face of criticism, we've seen some of that in the media, strategically making those walking and cycling investments permanent ahead of a likely automobile rebound, and to coordinate that with the transit service. And lastly, ongoing adaptation we see requires flexibility and nimble responses by cities and regions. So efforts like the Central Transit Corridor Monitoring Program, it's a great place to start, and coupled with sort of shorter, frequent surveys to gather evidence that will be used to support making these ongoing health, land use, transportation, and program adaptations going forward. And Pierre's got a few closing remarks.
So if transit becomes less effective as a way to promote density, well, maybe a pleasant, pedestrian, hospitable environment with a lot of activities, with a lot of animation, all of this taking place at the neighborhood scale would become a way of selling, of making density appealing. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, thank you both. We'll move on to the third presentation in this section on housing, and that's housing and implications in Waterloo Region.
Hello, Clarence.
Yes, go ahead, Justin.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let me just get organized here. Okay, thanks, Clarence. Hello, everyone. I'm Justin van der Merwe, an MA student in the School of Planning, and it's my privilege to present the work of Brian Doucet, professor in the same school, Marcus Mose, and myself. So during lockdown, many of us have had to work out how to use our living rooms as offices, gyms, classrooms, often in the same day and even sometimes at the same time. So we all know that housing and the notion of home are in a state of flux in the region due to COVID. But there are various supply side interventions that government can take that could help residents to adapt. And this relates both to non-market and market housing. So we found that the key areas to focus on are intra-provincial migration and especially out migration from the GTA. I'm sure that we've all been following the CTV coverage of the skyrocketing house prices in the region, with one offer coming in as much as high as $186,000 over the asking price. Although this may be good for those who are trying to turn a profit on their property, we should, of course, also consider those who can't afford a home at all. So ensuring access to affordable housing is also important, and especially for vulnerable populations. Lastly, we also need to deconstruct the changes in housing demand due to COVID and aim to meet these needs within the existing urban footprint. We also acknowledge that the trends that we are observing are not new, but similar to what Tara and Marcus have already said, that the pandemic has effectively amplified and accelerated the existing needs and housing crises in the region. Next slide, please. So regarding the monitoring of intra-provincial migration, the first point is that although there are no or few conclusive studies in this matter, there is anecdotal evidence to suggest that the pandemic has increased housing demand in the Waterloo region, and that the pandemic has effectively accelerated the trend of out-migration from the GTA. For example, Colleen Kohler, president of the KW Association of Realtors, recently suggested that upwards of 50% of agents showing properties to clients in the Waterloo region in July were actually GTA agents. Also, a recent survey by the Ontario Real Estate Association suggests that since the pandemic, interest in rural and suburban living has risen, with buyers looking for more outdoor and indoor space. Of course, this follows the general trend of working remotely, which allows people the option of living further away from work, with commuting times being less of a factor. The virus has then, in many senses, amplified the classical GTA push factors, such as small and expensive properties, dense living arrangements with long commutes, and also strengthened the relative push-pull factors, rather, from the side of the Waterloo region. For example, its relative affordability, more space, and strong and diverse economy. Of course, the likelihood of a move from GTA to Waterloo region is also supported by studies and StatCan data that demonstrate that Canada's gateway cities, such as Toronto, grow mostly because of immigrants coming into the country, whereas mid-sized urban areas such as Waterloo region see most of their net population growth due to intra-provincial migration. However, this in-migration is not indiscriminate, as we're also seeing increased discernment regarding the type and quality of housing. Larger homes, which can accommodate home offices and have extra space for children, for example, are particularly sought after. In July, year-on-year sales for single detached housing in KW rose by about 25%, with the average sales price of a single detached home being $745,000, up to around 21% compared to July in the previous year. Townhouses and apartment-style condos are also doing well, but saw slightly less growth. However, this is also happening at a time when inventory is low. It's about 28% less than it was in July a year ago. So this limited supply at a time when demand is rising is clearly pushing up the prices. So the point to stress is that COVID is clearly not the great equalizer, and that those who already lived in desirable housing, have access to financing, and are allowed to work from home are actually benefiting from the pandemic in many ways, whereas those who cannot get access to financing, are restricted to public commutes, and whose jobs require them to be on site, are largely unable to benefit from the pandemic. There are also several uncertainties linked to the fluctuations in the market, and that it is generally too early to tell what the overall outcomes of the pandemic on the housing market are likely to be. There's various trends to observe. In the interest of time, I'm not going to get into them all of them at the moment. Next slide, please. So although some of us may be excited about the influx of capital into the region, we must of course understand that this can't be at the expense of current residents and getting the housing mix right in terms of the community's needs. COVID-related downward economic pressure is likely to have what you could call a downgrading in the housing market generally, which will have a negative impact on most, but also present opportunities for some. For example, diminished income would obviously have an impact on tenants and landlords, but there's also been a collapse of Airbnb or the short-term rental markets due to COVID, while the real estate investment trusts may see opportunities in terms of buying up properties cheaply, which would also have mixed effects on affordability. So the homeless crisis has also obviously come to the fore during the pandemic. A common theme in the media coverage of the pandemic is how COVID effectively exposed the cracks in our society and created moments for self-reflection. The subtext was that the current interventions to assist the homeless should actually not be seen as band-aid interventions, or even particularly radical for that matter, but perhaps become the norm. Finding, of course, long-term solutions is important in light of possible second or third wave of the pandemic, and even, who knows, perhaps even a new pandemic in the future. However, few studies have actually investigated the effects of the pandemic on housing and vulnerable populations. But there is anecdotal evidence to suggest that, or rather to support the housing first approach. For example, some people who were temporarily housed in the Radisson during the pandemic felt that their dignity had been restored and that they had been given a chance to overcome addictions, or that they'd seen a general increase in their health, for example. The last point effectively relates to how political pressures and the releasing of finances due to COVID possibly presents an opportunity to develop publicly owned land for affordable housing and shelter purposes. Next slide, please. So the last point really relates to accurately understanding the shifts in housing demand due to COVID, and especially the need for more space. So this final point is perhaps most easily understood by breaking it up into a context, challenge, and then outlining the approach. So the context I've largely provided already, in the sense that COVID has changed the way people view their homes now a space for work, recreational purposes, and even educational purpose, and that more space is required. Of course, the challenge then is, how does one sort of replicate the elements that people like, that are normally synonymous with single detached housing, such as increased indoor and outdoor space, access to green spaces and trails, but in a way that doesn't contribute to the related negative aspects, such as further sprawl and further encroachment on green spaces. The approach is effectively then to place a greater emphasis on the design of individual units as well as larger developments. For example, aside from government approving the number of units, government could take greater ownership of design elements that seek to replicate some of these desirable elements. This would also, of course, entice people back to the urban cores as opposed to being pushed away or further out into the urban fringes of the city. Achieving these objectives then is also compatible with broader goals of sustainability and reducing automobile dependency. Next slide. So in the interest of time, just to conclude briefly, I would like to reiterate the value of monitoring intra-provincial migration flows, ensuring the provision of affordable housing, and of taking a proactive approach to design. Thank you. Back to you, Clarence.
Thank you so much, Justin. Appreciate it. All right, we now are in the question and answer section for this particular group on housing and density. Fascinating exploration. One of the questions that I see and would like to direct back to Marcus relates to, I guess, the spectrum of density, and is there a difference between sort of, or do cities that have sort of a broader spectrum of density fare better during COVID than cities that tend to have like the hyperdensity of a Shanghai or a Paris?
It's a good question. I think we don't quite know enough how the mix of density plays out, although I think it is notable that many of the initial assessments, even of the some are what we might call hyperdense places, that process and restrictions that were in place and sort of social convention played as large a role as the built environment in and of itself, right? So in places where, particularly the role of where government was quite proactive in terms of responding, putting restrictions in place, people wearing masks and all those kind of things, it is often argued played a larger role. I think the big factor to consider sort of in this mix of housing types is that I think it really depends on the context of the city, right? And so I think in our region it's made increasing sense for various reasons to build increasingly higher apartment buildings, for instance, but also at the same time recognizing that in terms of our overall housing mix, that's actually still a smaller part of our overall housing stock in the region, and that there is room to develop sort of a mix of housing types across the spectrum in the mid-rise sector in particular, I think.
And just staying with you for a second, Marcus, another question that was in the Q&A area relates to the notion of if you consider the region and our core areas and the amount of parkland that's there, what's your perspective on sort of the ability to sort of balance the density we're seeing and density that's coming with that green space? I mean, is there enough or, do we have enough to offset that increasing density in terms of that green space amenity that you identify as being so important?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think I can't answer it specifically because the cities and the region potentially as well would be doing assessments that relate the park space availability to the new growth, and so there's specific calculations and assessments that our local governments are already following to try and ensure that we have what we might consider adequate park space. Now, of course, an event like this makes us maybe as a society sort of reconsider, well, what is adequate park space, right? And so I think what I'm sort of urging is not necessarily on the one hand, I'm not necessarily saying there's not enough, but I think it requires a reassessment of what it means to have enough space. And the second point would be to say, I think one of the areas that we in the region here could probably benefit from is actually some of the smaller park spaces that are more interspersed within the living environment. So we have quite a few larger spaces, but sometimes, sort of having even smaller green spaces immediately within our downtowns or nodes, I think is something that I personally would pay more attention to.
All right, thank you. Getting to the question of the 15-minute city idea, interesting question that's come forward is in terms of the suburbs and thinking of our traditional suburban structures. Can that idea of the characteristics of the 15-minute city work in the traditional suburb area as well? Has that been promoted at all or thought about in terms of what you've seen in your work?
It's interesting that this concept was first put forward in the context of Paris, which has extremely high density. So you can create 15-minute cities pretty much everywhere in a place like Paris. It's just a matter of relocating activities because the density threshold is there to support this kind of configuration. And the context of Waterloo region, it would have to be in high density hubs. It would have to be created within the Waterloo environment because the suburban density cannot support that. Although one could argue, that downtown Kitchener, uptown Waterloo are 15-minute cities. Belmont Village is a bit of a 15-minute city as well, where you have a mixture of housing types. and a mixture of activities blended with that, you are able to create a 15-minute city. And a point that is interesting as well is that the creation of 15-minute cities, when it is pedestrian-based, is more flexible than transit-oriented development, because you're not as reliant on public transit infrastructure. So you can create them in more places than you can in the case of transit-oriented development. Niluka, do you have something to add to that?
Just was one of the other questions came about was looking at, like, say, Williamsburg, that neighborhood, and that's a good example, I think. So that's a neighborhood outside of the core area in Waterloo region, and it has sort of a smaller compact form. And part of it's got a cluster of shopping amenities around it and other services, and then it has some townhouses immediately around it, but then it sort of spreads out into more detached homes. But there's an example where you could build upon that kind of planned community, I think, and start to offer more of those amenities and start to increase some of the density if there was some land available. And I think there are some ongoing developments around there that will increase density. So I think there's a good opportunity in some of those locations to kind of create that 15-minute city.
And in the case of Williamsburg, you would need to improve the pedestrian environment as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Great, thank you. I guess a question for Justin related to, you suggested sort of the GTA activity flowing into the Waterloo region and the focus on monitoring intraprovincial migration. Have you got recommendations on what's the best way, like in terms of the data sources for that? That's a bit tricky to try and follow, is it not?
Yeah, I would imagine. Well, the sources, the anecdotal evidence that I pointed to was the agents looking at the GTA agents showing clients property in the Waterloo region. So actual real estate data that one needs to go to. I'm not sure they always track who the address the person has come from, but there are ways of doing that through real estate data.
Right.
The other interesting angle is to take more of a comparative approach, where say regions on the outer edge or outside of the greater golden horseshoe have common factors, and then also look at sort of trends comparatively across regions.
Yeah, and certainly the notion of where people are choosing to live vis-a-vis the opportunities in the housing market in the employment market looks very different. Tying it back to where we started this afternoon, exploring the notion of work is now a very different consideration as well. So, it's not just about the region, but it's obviously about the proximal regions as well, and what's going on in terms of their economy. That's an important consideration.
That's right.
Absolutely.
Is there time to quickly jump in there, Clarence?
Yeah, please go ahead, Marcus.
No, that I agree with what's been said, and I think the other thing that we have to keep in mind in terms of that migration is that just recently there were numbers made available now, and in terms of international migration, of course, we know that international, so immigration into Canada is part of the big driver of the large city housing markets, particularly the GTA in Ontario, and so with the slowdown of immigration into the GTA, depending on how long they persist, you might also see a bit of a softening of the housing market in the GTA, which then maybe, sort of slows down a bit of that spillover effect into surrounding regions. So it's one of these things that has a lot of variables at play, and that's really difficult to predict ahead of time, but it's one that I think we need to keep our eye on. But in addition at looking at the local migration, we could use immigration as a sign as to, well, what are the pressures on the GTA market? And if that pressure is fairly strong, is it likely to spill over into our area?
Thank you, Marcus. Trying to capture some of the questions that are in the forum as well. I just broadly, I'll open it up to all the presenters in this section. What are your thoughts around, before COVID, housing affordability was a central issue. how do you now see that discussion and the efforts underway in terms of policy responses in particular to address housing affordability through the work that you've done?
I can jump in there.
Sure.
So in terms of housing affordability, I think some of the pressures that we'll see actually relate to some of the things we talked about, a while ago earlier when we started our symposium today about the changing economy. And so if we have more and more people that are out of work or incomes aren't growing for some people, it will of course affect housing demand. So I think the expectation would be that we'd see greater affordability concerns, but that those affordability concerns they're not going to be evenly distributed, right? There's going to be a polarizing effect in many ways. And so I think as in terms of a policy response, looking at some of the figures we were shown earlier about unemployment and the existence of a recession, it would seem, I think, that preparing for greater affordability need, whether it's through income assistance or on the supply side, would be something that I think policy would be needing to look to. I think one of the things we're probably fortunate on is that the federal government had been supplementing income for people that were out of work, which I think would have helped alleviate some of these affordability pressures. That's when people are out of work and they can't afford their rent or mortgages, you'd likely see some of those pressures amplified. So definite policy opening there, I think, at various levels of government.
I think there are three factors at work with respect to housing affordability at the moment. One of it is people adjust their housing according to their needs. So there's the whole issue, and that came out in Justin's paper. I mean, people moving to bigger houses, going for single family homes. And I don't see that, it was interpreted in the paper as being, people benefiting from the pandemic. I don't think they're benefiting in any way from the pandemic. It is just that in their circumstances, this is their way of adjusting. So they're leaving a place like in central Toronto where they had a smaller house that was more expensive than what they're buying at the periphery of the metropolitan region. So this is one factor. The other factor as well is that there would be housing crisis, a major housing crisis due to poverty, essentially. People losing their jobs, not being able to afford their house anymore. So, in these kind of circumstances, if they're left to themselves, they become homeless, or they have to go back, as adults living with their parents, or find some kind of arrangements of that nature. And I think there's a third factor at play, which is a bit related to the first one I've mentioned, is the change of scale in the activities within metropolitan regions. The market that is the hottest at the moment is the market of cottages in the Muskokas, okay? People wanting to move out. They see themselves as being able, not having to commute anymore, so then they want to go out and live in a country, have plenty of space. But the other side of this phenomenon is likely to be a much reduced demand for living in downtown areas. If people can work from home, what's the point of living downtown areas? If a lot of people, if there's less people during the day, there'll be less activities in the downtown areas. So what's the point of paying a $2,500 rent, a month to live in downtown Toronto when you've got only about half what existed there in terms of stores, in terms of activities, and you don't need to go to your job anymore. So I think the price of that specific housing stock may well decline significantly in the future. And there would be much less construction, if not no construction at all, of new housing in the downtown areas.
All right, we're going to leave it there for this Q&A period, and thanks again to all three groups for their presentations.